Okay, thank you, Mr. Inoue. There we go. So now we'd like to begin our first session. So I'd like to introduce our first guest speaker. Mr. Don Burton is a Managing Director of Techstars and is also running an accelerator program for Kaplan. And as you may know, Techstars is also providing an accelerator program to Disney, which is a great way to push the large companies to open innovation. So let's give him a nice warm welcome. So Don, can you please take the stage? Thank you.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. It's been 20 years since I worked in Japan with McKinsey & Company and Ken Omai on a project assessing the impact of digital convergence way back in 1990s, really at the beginning of the internet and web and mobile technologies. And that project and living in Japan was one of the highlights of my professional experience. So it's a delight to be back, and thank you. You know, one of the only Japanese phrases that is burned into my memory from that time period is "Konnichiwa, Don Burton des, New York karakamashita, dozo yoroshiku." And every meeting we had, I recited that, so it's been burned right in there. So, thank you again. And I'm still working with web and mobile technologies, and I've launched startup communities based on these technologies as a managing director at Techstars and as the CEO and founder of EdTech Studios. And what I'd like to talk about today is creating entrepreneurial ecosystems. And the United States has been, and a lot of cities in the United States, have been very good at creating vibrant startup communities within their cities. And I'm sure everyone in this audience has heard of Silicon Valley, but how many of you have heard of Boulder, Colorado? A show of hands. How many have actually heard of Boulder, Colorado? Not a lot, because it's, you know, a small little town. Yet Boulder, Colorado has more entrepreneurs as a percent of the population than probably any city in the entire world. And it's a bit of a startup miracle whose story is actually quite relevant to any city that's trying to create and grow their entrepreneurial community. So let me tell you a little bit about Boulder. The story of Boulder is actually captured in a book called Startup Communities, which is written by Brad Feld, who is one of the founders of Techstars, which operates a lot of startup accelerators. And he tells the story of Boulder in his book. And what I'm going to do is just kind of summarize a little bit about it, but it's quite amazing because Boulder, again, is only a city of 200,000 people. And it has no kind of special assets or infrastructure that one would think, wow, this is going to really become an amazing entrepreneurial city. It's basically in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and it used to be known as kind of a hippie town that people would hang out, you know, near the Flatiron. So it's actually quite an interesting story, and if Boulder can become a startup powerhouse, anyone can become a startup powerhouse. And so let me tell you a little bit about the story of Boulder, and kind of in the book that Brad Feld has written, he talks about kind of 4 core principles of what makes a successful startup community. And he calls these principles the Boulder thesis. And one of the first principle of the Boulder thesis is that it needs to be entrepreneur-led. So there's lots of stakeholders who care about creating and building entrepreneurial communities, such as the government, large corporations, universities, investors, but it really, to be a successful thing, a successful startup community, you really need to have a hardcore set of entrepreneurial leaders. And it needs to be a dynamic set of leaders that can change year to year, but they're really committed to creating an entrepreneurial community. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Also, it needs to be a long-term commitment. Entrepreneurial communities don't just happen overnight, and the leaders of that thing have to have a real commitment to that city and want to be there for the long term, you know, through ups and downs, which will naturally happen in any community and any economy. It also needs to be inclusive of all. Brad Feld talks about the patriarch problem of startup communities where there might be some patriarch who has a lot of money, who became wealthy in the past, who wants to be the leader of everything and kind of becomes a bottleneck for that entrepreneurial community. So it needs to be really anybody that's interested in participating, you welcome them with open arms and you get them a role within the community. So that it needs to be very inclusive. And then also he talks about full stack engagement, where you have events like this, but you also have a lot of events that help the entrepreneurs actually with the operations and getting their businesses built. And those could be startup weekends, they could be startup accelerators like Techstars runs, they can be incubators like here in the Innovation Hub. And those are the types of full stack activities that really get everybody engaged, whether you're an investor, government, or whatever, gets lots of people involved in that startup community. So if we take those principles, what Techstars has done is they've actually helped create 15 different startup communities in different cities and in different vertical sectors. And in the city programs, Techstars has largely been focused in the United States, but they're starting to go international, and they're in Europe right now in 2 different cities in Europe. And you can see the list of cities. They have Boulder, Boston, New York, Chicago, London, Seattle, Austin, Texas is an extremely entrepreneurial place, and again, has just grown tremendously like a Boulder, where you wouldn't think it would become an entrepreneurial place, and it's just taken off. And Berlin as well has a wonderful startup community. And so Techstars has been instrumental and helpful in creating these startup communities, and I'll talk more about what they do and how they do that. In addition to doing city programs, which are kind of taking applications from any company in any industry, Techstars also runs vertical or sector programs that are focused on one industry. And that's where I come from. I come from the ed tech industry, and we did in partnership with Kaplan, which is a test prep company in the United States. We ran an ed tech accelerator in New York City, which I'll tell you more about. But they also work with other large corporations and other verticals, such as Disney, who was mentioned, RGA for the Internet of Things, Sprint for Health Mobile, Barclays Bank for financial services technology, and Qualcomm for a robotics accelerator. So they have a pretty broad range of city programs and sector programs, and have been very successful at applying those principles to helping successful startup communities get going. And in those communities, they get the entrepreneurs led, and they really try to get a bunch of activities for the stakeholders across the ecosystem. So in any entrepreneurial community, you're going to have the entrepreneurs, you're going to have the mentors of the entrepreneurs, because you have first-time entrepreneurs, you have seasoned entrepreneurs, you have entrepreneurs that have exited and have a large exit and might be angel investors now. So you have a very diverse set of people, and the more seasoned one becomes mentors for the younger ones. You have government help, and the economic development offices at different governments are very interested in getting the community going and can support that community. There's university support, there's investors, there's large companies, there's service providers like lawyers that want to provide services to the entrepreneurs. So that entire system, whenever you go into a community and try to start up, it's really aligning those and getting everybody kind of working in the right direction and pulling gears to get the startup community going. So, and another part of that, again, is really engaging people in programs where they can collaborate together. And this is what Techstars does is, I call it an anchor program, because it's really a wonderful galvanizing event to have a program come in where there's capital for these companies, there's a 3-month program, and everyone can come together for that 3 months and really give active hands-on participation with the entrepreneurs in that community. So, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about exactly this, but this is what I call an anchor program. Techstars comes in and they will run from launch and recruit the companies, and they execute the 3-month program to help the entrepreneurs get to the next level and raise their next round of financing and then get funded. And let me tell you a little bit about my experience in New York City. So again, I'm focused on the education technology sector. And when we went into New York City, New York City has a lot of old publishers, so there's a lot of Pearson has headquarters in the US, in New York City, McGraw-Hill, Macmillan. So these are all kind of educational publishers, very old school, traditional textbook type of publishers. But there wasn't much of a vibrant community. Like Silicon Valley has a lot of startups, and EdTech was one more of those. They don't have much of the old industry structure in Silicon Valley, but they have a lot of EdTech startups. Well, New York City has a lot of infrastructure. We have a lot of instructional design. We have the whole value chain of the EdTech world in the East Coast and in New York City primarily. And yet it wasn't a hub of entrepreneurial activity around EdTech. So when we came into it, there were the people that were there. There were nice EdTech startups that were there that immediately when we were thinking about starting up this EdTech accelerator, we went in to the CEOs of 2U, which is an online college degree program, to Code Academy is in New York City, and we went to the CEO and founder of Code Academy. We went to Skillshare, we went to Newton, and these are kind of some of the startups that were already in New York City that were EdTech startups, and we got them to say, hey, would you be a mentor to our program? Will you help us build a much stronger New York ecosystem? And they were committed to do that. We also, and so we had a really good set of entrepreneurs that could be the leaders of this EdTech community in New York City. We also got Kaplan Education, which again is a big, large corporation. It's probably about $2.5 billion corporation that's headquartered in New York City. They were instrumental in getting these corporations as part of this startup community. They were instrumental in becoming part of this because they gave us their space, they sponsored the program and paid for the operating costs of the startup accelerator. And then we also got the investors, so the venture community in New York City. We went to them and made sure that as part of the accelerator program, we weren't just going to give $20,000 to each company, which was a typical accelerator program might give a little amount of money, like $20,000, but we also added another $150K note so that the accelerator program had $170K or $170,000 worth of financing when you came into the accelerator program. So it was very attractive to entrepreneurs to become a part of the program as well. So getting the participation of the entrepreneurs of a large corporation like Kaplan and getting the investors behind this and giving the notes and putting money down to put into those convertible notes were very important to kick off the startup community. So once we went into New York and we got all the partners aligned, we put out the applications for EdTech companies to come to the accelerator program. And in our first year, we had over 300 applications for 10 positions in the accelerator program. And so we selected what we thought were the 10 best EdTech startups. And then what we do is we put them through a 3-month accelerator program. And I don't know how many are familiar with startup accelerator programs, but a mentor-driven startup accelerator program follows a 3-month cycle where the first month is really mentor-intensive and customer development-intensive, where the entrepreneurs are going out into the marketplace talking to customers. They're meeting with experienced, seasoned entrepreneurs and mentors every day, and we call it like speed dating session, where they'll go, one seasoned entrepreneur or mentor will come in for office hours for 4 hours and meet with each company for a half hour and give them reactions to their strategy, their go-to-market strategy, their overarching strategy, what they think the issues are and what they think is right or wrong about how they're approaching the market. So we give them access to all these wonderful, great mentors that have been successful and that can say, hey, I've been there, I've made these types of mistakes, let me mentor you. So that first month is really intensive as far as getting external feedback from both customers and mentors and then iterating your idea and pivoting your idea. So that happens in the first month, and all of our EdTech companies, I would say, really changed some parts of their strategy in order to access the market and to be more successful as a company. And then in the second month, we really focus on execution. So in order to get funding at the end of the third month, you really have to show traction. So you've pivoted your idea, you've gotten more clarity about what you really think it is, and then in the second month, you are acquiring customers, you're iterating your product more quickly, you're really taking the traction and getting the traction you need so that you have a story to prove to investors, and you're developing the evidence that this is going to really work and it's worth to invest in me. So in that third month then, so with traction continues, but you also then in our Startup Accelerator, you start to work on your storytelling and your fundraising pitch. So it's really important to be able to articulate your story in a really compelling way, and Techstars works really aggressively in that last month so that the entrepreneurs and the companies and founders can present their story in a really compelling way and get that next round of financing. And on average, the Techstars graduates will raise money. My first class, 100% of the companies raised money after the accelerator, and they raised more than 15 million. So on average, they raised about 1.5 million each after they graduated from the program. And 1 year later, so this is my 2013 class, that the market valuation of those 10 startups is now more than $100 million. So it's been an extremely successful startup. And New York City now, we've had our second program in 2014, and it's been extremely successful. And we've had really a wonderful galvanizing of the community around EdTech. And so the leaders of EdTech and the entrepreneurs of EdTech and the large corporations of EdTech have really been supporting this community, and it's really taken off and is working quite well. So we're going into our third year now. In addition to creating entrepreneurial ecosystems, and that's just one case study of an example in New York City and in the EdTech vertical. And I do think it's interesting that, in Boulder, Colorado, with only 200,000 people, it's pretty much just a startup community, and it's very horizontal, and all the entrepreneurs don't care what industry you're in; they'll just help you because you're an entrepreneur. In a place like New York City that is substantially larger than a Boulder, it really does. The startup communities kind of align around a sector. So our EdTech community doesn't really hang out that much with the advertising tech community. It's much more of a unified group within that sector, but you can have your own, you can have multiple startup communities, and sure, there's some overlap, but you can have multiple startup communities within one city as well. And that's what's happening in New York City, because there are different verticals and different sectors that have different startup communities, and the vibrancy is almost more dependent on the vertical than it is cross verticals like it is in Boulder. So it's an interesting phenomenon. And then in addition, I've gotten a lot of inbound traffic. I'm an ex-McKinsey consultant, and I've gotten a lot of inbound traffic about large corporations saying, hey, how do we get some of that startup juice? And how do we become more innovative internally at our large corporation, which doesn't move as quick as these entrepreneurs do these days. And so we've started to experiment helping to create entrepreneurial ecosystems within large companies. So within a large company, just like in the external marketplace or the VC-backed marketplace, it's really follows a very similar path. As a big company, if I'm want a bunch of ideas and a lot of innovation to happen, how do I identify talent and generate ideas? How do I incubate those ideas and kind of help them get going and start along? And then if it's real and it looks good, how do I accelerate it and give it more investment and take it to the next level and then scale it up to be one of my core businesses and stuff? So this is the process that big corporations need to think about and go through. And there's a program or kind of an entrepreneurial program for each one of these steps. So for example, if I'm a big company, I might want to run startup weekends internally within my company. So we can have hackathons, we can have startup weekends where employees will get up and pitch their idea for, I don't know how many people are familiar with startup weekends, but everybody gets up and pitches for 1 minute whatever their idea is, and then the 12 best ideas or 10 best ideas or whatever the number is, those form teams, and over that weekend they actually build out a prototype for that idea, and they start to build that company. And you can do the same type of programs that are in the external entrepreneurial system. You can do those internally at the large corporation. And then winners of those competitions could be given, like in the United States, Google has a policy of 20% of your time you can use for generating your own ideas and pursuing your own ideas. So like 1 day a week, you can go pursue your own idea. Well, Google does that for all employees, but a lot of companies don't want to have that much time for people to go chase their own stuff. But if you gave that reward to people that won and had the best ideas out of the startup weekends or the hackathons, that's a good way to informally incubate the idea. And so you can incubate the idea without losing the full-time job yet. And then if that prototype and stuff gets enough traction to accelerate it, you can make it more formal, and you can kind of do a friends and family round where the company gives them a budget and gives them a dedicated team and starts to operate internally. So again, and then scaling the business, it's the same as the lean startup. You want to scale it as quickly as you can. So large companies are trying to follow this process internally inside their organization. So you can actually create, and people like Intuit have been really successful at starting to create entrepreneurial ecosystems within their large organizations. So, and I have a company in a studio incubator that I have called Corporate Innovation Partners that helps companies do this. So, okay, so that's kind of creating entrepreneurial ecosystems like Techstars does in different cities or in different sectors in a city, and then also creating entrepreneurial ecosystems in large corporations. Now I'd like to kind of turn our attention, because as I mentioned, I'm an education technology person. So my expertise is I've been a serial entrepreneur in education, and that's where I run all of education technology sector for Techstars. Basically, there's nothing like a industry and a sector that's primed for disruption that will help with entrepreneurial ecosystem as well. And in education, it couldn't be more from the truth. It's a great opportunity for an entrepreneurial ecosystem, because we really believe that in the next 20 years, we're going to see more change in education than we have in the last 1,000. And education is like a $5 trillion sector globally. So it's a lot of money is spent on education, but yet it hasn't really changed that much in lots of years. So that's a real good opportunity for change. And so basically, in the education sector, we can take a quick tour of why we think that is. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time kind of going over the education sector and why this is such a ripe place for education, or for entrepreneurial ecosystems and entrepreneurial disruption. So let's start our tour by looking at the existing schooling system. So in schools today, you have large lecture formats, something like this. You have small lecture formats. You have butts and seats. You have obedient hand raising. And you have lots and lots of worksheets. And of course, the number 2 pencil and standardized assessments. So if you look at all these images, they really reveal a distinctive set of technologies that are kind of comprise compulsory schooling. And when these technologies were first invented, they were amazingly successful at taking a society that was largely illiterate, teaching them reading, writing, and arithmetic, and creating mass literacy like we have today. So it was an amazingly successful system, right? And these technologies that they used for compulsory schooling produced amazing results. But they're now hundreds of years old, and everything needs to change at some point. And technology has changed everything. If you look at the manufacturing floor, right? Complete change. Doesn't look like anything it did 100 years ago. Same with the operating room. The operating room today and the operating room of the past look nothing alike. Not so much with education. So in education, technology has changed everything except education, right? And education as an industry, surprisingly enough, if you look at financial services, 20% of the cost of financial services goes into technology expenses. And education is dead last as far as a sector in its historical spending on technology. It spends less than 1% of its budget on technology. And that's about to change. And again, nothing stays the same forever. And even education has been totally transformed in the past. So if you look at the agricultural age, it ushered in the apprenticeship model of education. And if you look at our industrial age, that's when we ushered in the compulsory schooling model of education. And it is inevitable that the digital age will usher in a completely new form of education. The question is, what is that new form of education? And we really haven't even started to scratch the surface on what the new system will look like, because we're so mired in the industrial age system that we have today. But again, our digital information communication infrastructure requires a whole new set of skills. So reading, writing, and arithmetic are necessary, but not sufficient anymore, right? So what is this new form of education going to look like as technology starts to pour in to the education sector? And I see 3 scenarios of where investment dollars are going into education. And I call them old school, new school, and real school. And let's start with old school. So in old school, the technologies are really, primarily the objective is to make what we do today more efficient or effective, okay? So you have a chalkboard becomes a smart board, right? A hard copy textbook becomes a digital textbook. And hard copy or handwritten messages from teacher to home now become text messages from teacher to home, right? And you could take the entire old wine of schooling and put it in a new bottle. Let's take that whole system and put it online, right? And that's what you get in kind of the first wave of online courses. They're exactly like what we do in a classroom setting in the old technology. We just put it into a new bottle called online, and it's the same old stuff, but people think that's innovative. I call that old school. Still the same old stuff. It's like when we invented the camera and film for the first time, they said, oh, what do we do with this thing? Let's put it at the back of the vaudeville act and just film what they're doing on stage. But that's not what we're doing in film today, and it took a while for the technology to be used in a completely new and innovative way. And the same thing's happening in education. But even in this model of investment, there's been a lot of value creation. So we have companies and startups and even older companies like University of Phoenix, which is the biggest for-profit educator in the United States. It did an IPO, it started a while ago, and it did an IPO and got to a market cap of more than $7 billion by just putting courses online and charging degrees for them. And then we have Wireless Generation, which sold to News Corp for $400 million. We have Coursera that's valued at hundreds of millions of dollars and has raised more than $85 million. Remind, just a text messages for parents, has raised over $100 million, or raised $60 million at hundreds of millions of valuation. So again, there's been a lot of value creation with technology companies going in to feed old school, okay? But the next scenario is new school. And new school is really all about core process reengineering for the same agenda of the existing school system. But instead of doing it the old way, let's figure out a new way to achieve those objectives. So we have what's called the flipped classroom. So instead of watching lectures in the school and while you're at school, let's watch the lectures at home. And then when we come to school, we can work more in small groups, and we can do our worksheets, and I can move around as a teacher and help you a little bit more because you've already looked at the lecture and I can see where I need to help you more. And so this is kind of a new way of doing the existing stuff. And we have something like Khan Academy is another example in this area where it's more personalized. So if you start your math stuff and you're getting these kind of questions wrong, it adapts the types of content, the lectures you get and the types of stuff based on where you are. So it's kind of adaptive. It makes, you don't have to just wait for your class anymore. You can move along as quickly as you want by spending more time, and depending on how good you are at math, you can just keep going up the learning curve and you don't have to stop because you've already done second grade math. You're done. So, and then as we move to kind of one computer per child in a classroom, you're seeing lots more of these types of adaptive technologies, and you're seeing things like Newton and Grocket and others that are trying to use big data to help better customize the curriculum to where you are and what you need. So again, and then online universities, they're also using much more of a group kind of setting. They're using the technology in a much different way to get interaction amongst peers and to leverage the network of the professor, the TAs, and all the other students in that class. So you're getting very different uses of technology to kind of do the same thing, but let's do it in a different way. And that's what I call new school. And there's been, again, a lot of value creation in New School. So Newton, which is probably the leader in the United States for adaptive, personalized learning stuff, they've raised over $150 million and are probably over $1 billion valuation already. Again, lynda.com, which teaches kind of coding and other types of skills, has raised over $100 million. 2U did an IPO at over about $1 billion. And then Code Academy has raised about $30 million. So again, lots of startups and companies in these areas, and a lot of them making a lot of money in each one of these different scenarios, and New School the same. Real School is the last scenario that I want to talk about, and it is actually trying to go beyond the classroom. So in Real School, you're seeing environments that don't look like the classroom at all. We have a company called Dev Boot Camp, which is kind of a 3-month boot camp to learn coding skills. And you have hands-on projects, you're working in teams, and it doesn't look like a classroom setting at all, not an old school or a new school setting. You have General Assembly, which is similar stuff. They'll teach UX and data science and other types of skills, internet startup type of skills as well. And again, their environments don't look anything like the traditional schooling environments. And I would even say Techstars, when we have a startup accelerator, it's a boot camp, and I view it as an education institution, because we have a project-based curriculum where every startup cares about their project. They really care about the problem. They put their time and effort into it. They put their own money into it. They put their friends and family money into it. They care about the outcome and building a successful business, and they are just hungry for curriculum. We teach them in that 3-month boot camp environment, we teach them customer acquisition skills, product development skills, strategy skills. We teach them a broad range of stuff, and they are hungry for that curriculum. If it makes their business better and they get more customer acquisition, they just want more and they're hungry for it. So it's a really an educational model that I think rivals. I went to Harvard Business School. I think this is a better experience than Harvard Business School because it's personal and it's what they care about. It's and instead of just a bunch of random cases that they're doing 10 a night. This is what they really care about. So I think the kind of model, I think a startup accelerator is almost like a good model for what the future of education might look like in this Real School model. And there are other places that use this. In traditional settings, there might be a department like at MIT, there's a thing called the MIT Media Lab. And the MIT Media Lab looks much more like this Real School where kids aren't just sitting to lectures all the time. They've got a big project that they really care about, like building these robotic cars or driverless cars, and all their classes are aligned to help them get the skills to better build their project. So that's MIT Media Lab. Same thing at Stanford, at the design school of Stanford. Very much project-based, hands-on learning that looks very different than traditional learning settings. And those are at the higher ages. At the youngest ages of preschool, like Reggio Emilia schools, which are based in Italy, they're world-renowned as doing amazing long-term projects with 2- and 3-year-olds. And I'll just give you a quick example. The kids come up with their own ideas like, hey, why don't we build an amusement park for birds in our backyard here? Yeah, that seems like a reasonable preschool idea. Let's go build an amusement park for birds. In the United States or a traditional classroom, that idea would kind of be laughed at and we'd move on to the math assignment, right? In Reggio Emilia, Italy, they take that idea very seriously and they actually constructed a long-term project where kids would create flowing water and fountains and all sorts of different things for birds, and they'd go construct that in their back playground. And they would build it. And there's a lot of curriculum embedded around that. And 2- and 3-year-old kids are sustaining like a 3- or 4-month project around their own ideas. And they're motivated to do that. So again, these types of education settings look very different than the traditional settings. And again, there has been a lot of value creation starting to happen here as well. So General Assembly I mentioned, they've raised more than $50 million. Duolingo is a language learning application that basically starts you off by just speaking right away and supports your language learning. Code Academy, Skillshare. These are examples of successful companies or beginning to be successful companies in the Real School model. And let me, before I get there, if you look at all these examples, certainly as an investor, you might want to hedge your bets and invest across all of these different scenarios because, again, there's money being made in all the different scenarios, and we really do need to improve each one of those cases because the bulk of the student population sits in old school right now, right? And so basically, there are going to be a lot of opportunities and there's a lot of money in that one as well. So, but if you look at across, how are we really going to get, in the next 20 years, more change in the education sector than we have in the last 1,000? I really believe it is all about the real school model because what we're doing is we're changing from a push model where we have curriculum and we want to shove it down your throats to a more pull model where you're highly motivated to become better at something. Like, I want to build a business and start up technology. I want to become a coder to get a better job and to get an entry-level job as a coding thing. I'm highly motivated to learn that stuff, and it's a pull model of learning and education. And so again, this quote comes from a while ago, which is, education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. And I think what you're seeing and what will change dramatically in the new era of the future of education will be much more of this pull model of education where you've got a desire to become better at something or to learn something, and then you're going to pull through the curriculum with all this customized adaptive technology and big data to give you the right stuff at the right time. And again, it kind of just makes sense that education would be more organized around living and projects, right? Because in the real world, there's an infinite amount of interesting things. I mean, if you think about the adult world, how many roles and responsibilities? It's like limitless, right? There's a million things to do in the real world. And a lot of these things are extremely fun and exciting. Like, I love what I do, right? And, you can build robots. You can, do 3D printing, design a 3D something, and then print it out on your 3D printer. You can, code your own world in Minecraft. You can, in the media arts, you can create your own film, your own music, your own fashion, and you can start up your own companies. So, the living, organizing education around living, I think is where we're really going to see the future of education, and we're going to get an explosion of change in this sector. So, what the characteristics of this change is really there's going to be much smarter experiences. Instead of that, the existing technology, when I showed you those images of the schooling stuff, very narrow performances of filling out worksheets, kind of standardized tests and short answers and stuff like that. You're going to see that's what we think of learning and education today. It's really going to be smarter experiences that look more like what you do in the real world. Build companies, build robots, build 3D designs. Also, you're going to have smarter pathways. You're going to have big data driving customized learning so it's not one size fits all, right? And then smarter scorecards. We don't do a very good job of saying, what can you really do and what do you really know? We give you a degree from some university or we give you an SAT score, but we have no idea what competences you have. And there's a big trend in the States saying, what are micro-credentials and how do we better represent what learning and competences really are? So again, this is the education technology sector, and there's a lot of opportunity for entrepreneurs to create this disruption, this transformation that's on the horizon. And that's a great way to attract entrepreneurial talent is by finding a sector that really needs disruption. And so I'm excited about education technology for sure. And here's my contact information. If you're interested in any of this, feel free to email me and ask any questions. But thank you for having me.